Well, I have an easier job than most of the discussants because I only have to talk about one paper instead of synthesizing things from 3 or 4. So I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and I was delighted to have the chance to think about this paper in more depth and detail and to share some of those thoughts with you. And I think I'm going to focus on 3 things. I'm going to focus on how this paper to me is unique. I'm going to focus on what the key findings that really struck me, and some of those Suzanne mentioned, and then talk a little bit about future research. The world, the nation, the workforce, you and I, we're all getting older, right? And we're all working longer. The paper showed that really clearly. So obviously there are some implications here for policy, and these data will help us understand what it is we need to do in order to help those people who are working longer continue to have the skills that they need to be productive parts of the workforce. So this paper really looked at the extent that older adults take advantage of adult education and training, formal, which leads to some kind of a degree, you know, that's your college stuff, non-formal, which may be stuff like non-credit at community colleges. I'll say more about that later, you expect me to. And then what kinds of things is that associated with? So this paper is unique in 2 ways. One is, it uses multiple data sources. It doesn't just use the PIAAC, although it does use that very effectively, but it also uses the Survey of Consumer Finances from the Federal Reserve, so that they can actually look at the net worth of older adults. And that's really important as you think about these adults moving into retirement. What kind of assets are there for those adults to live on in retirement? And not surprisingly, the paper shows a huge disparity between the people in the lowest income quartile and the people in the highest income quartile in terms of the assets that they will have available to them at retirement. It also does a qualitative document analysis of AET policies and practices in the 5 countries that the paper looked at, and I just have to say right off the bat, even though I'm a statistician, my bias is that qualitative and quantitative need to be married and live together, so that what we learn from the qualitative analysis spurns quantitative analysis that helps us understand what we're seeing in the data. So I really applaud the authors for taking that approach in this paper and wanting to continue to do some work in that area. I also think that this paper is unique, although not as unique as I thought when I wrote these notes, in that it uses the background questionnaire exclusively. It does not use literacy, numeracy, and problem solving in a technology-rich environment. Now, I do need to acknowledge that Danielle Lindemann's paper also used the background questionnaire exclusively, but somebody said earlier today that this is the finest background questionnaire in an adult assessment that we've ever had. It certainly is very comprehensive. I happen to know off the top of my head that only 5 minutes of the content were US specific. The rest of the content was across the international background questionnaires, but it is very deep and very rich. And this paper illustrates the power of that background questionnaire to help us understand what's going on. It presents a compelling and interesting analysis without even looking at the skill measures. So here are the most striking findings that I found. Participation in adult education and training, even at older ages, is associated with increased odds of employment, increased income, and increased participation in the labor force. Yet, there is a huge gap in participation between those in the highest income quartiles and the lowest income quartiles. And in the US, for 45 to 54-year-olds, that gap is the biggest across all the countries. It's huge, okay? So, and why? And Suzanne alluded to this. In the US, in the 2 lowest income quartiles, and for women, they said, it's too expensive. It's too expensive. Okay, you can figure out what the policy implication of that is. Okay, so we need AET programs and policies for older adults, and especially those who are low income and unemployed. And we need to recognize in the education enterprise and in training of the importance of including older adults as we plan those programs and policies. Very often, I've been in education my whole life. Very often when we think about education, we think about K-12, obviously, or we think about those young people entering the workforce. How well prepared are they? Well, the fact of the matter is, most of the people in the workforce are not those younger people. So as we design policies to put people in the pipeline with the skills, great, I applaud you, right? But we need to be thinking about how we prepare the incumbent workers for the skills that they need to do their jobs. I used to work in teacher training, same issue. We can change teacher education programs all we want, but we have to also be supporting in-service teachers. So just a couple points about future directions. First is, I think that these data could benefit from looking at the skill measures, and they are talking about doing that as a follow-on to this research. It would be really interesting to look at the participation in AET by skill level in conjunction with some of these other variables. Also, they mentioned the supplemental sample. That's been mentioned several times. That's going to become available in 2016. And there are two things for this particular analysis. Suzanne mentioned the expansion of the sample to include the 66 to 74 year age group, and that's really going to be valuable for us to understand older workers in the workforce. But it also has an oversample of the unemployed. So it's possible that that supplemental sample can help us better understand how the unemployed are accessing and using these kinds of adult education and training programs. And I do want to say, as I mentioned earlier, I really like this concept of using qualitative analysis, and the researchers have said that they want to continue to do that, and I applaud that. And finally, you can't put me in front of a microphone and on a podium without me saying something about non-degree credentials. When PIAAC was originally being developed, we were at the very early stages in the federal statistical system of trying to figure out how to measure things like industry recognized certifications, occupational licenses, and educational certificates. We've now come a very long way. And in future administrations of adult literacy assessments in NCES, we will make sure that we have good, valid measures of the acquisition of those kinds of credentials, which are the result of this non-formal education process in many cases. Sometimes they're also the results of the formal education process. But it's a way for us to understand the credentials that people are bringing to employers and saying, I have the skills and knowledge to do this job. So if you want to know more about that, by the way, you see the little acronym after my name in the agenda, GEMEnA, just Google it, you'll find it. Okay, and that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.